Hello, friends. There's a moment we all know too well, the kind of moment where your heart feels heavy for no clear reason, where life hasn't completely fallen apart, but it doesn't feel safe either, where you smile on the outside, but on the inside, something is trembling. And in those moments, the silence can feel louder than any noise. That's usually when fear starts whispering, "What if you're alone in this? What if this pain stays? What if you're not strong enough?" And right in that fragile space, comes one of the most powerful promises ever spoken. Don't be upset. I am with you. And not after you figure it out. Not once you stop crying. Not when you become fearless. But right now, fear is loud. It shows up uninvited, raising its voice in the quiet moments, filling the spaces where hope used to rest. It doesn't knock before entering. It barges in, convincing us that the worst outcome is the most likely one. Fear speaks in absolutes. It tells us we are alone, that what we are facing is too big, that this moment will define us forever. And the most dangerous thing about fear isn't just the pain it creates. It's how convincing it sounds when we're tired, vulnerable, and already carrying too much. But presence is louder. Presence doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it doesn't overwhelm. Presence shows up and stays, and when Jesus says, "Don't be upset, I am with you," He's offering a kind of presence that doesn't compete with fear by matching its volume. Instead, it overpowers fear by refusing to leave. Fear depends on isolation to survive. Presence dissolves isolation. So many of us believe that fear means something has gone wrong. We assume that if we were stronger, more faithful, more confident, we wouldn't be afraid. But the truth is, fear is often a sign that we care deeply. It appears when something matters. It shows up when we're standing at the edge of change, loss, or uncertainty. Fear doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're human. What makes fear seem so loud is that it speaks to our imagination. It drags us into futures that haven't happened yet. It replays past wounds as if they're guarantees. It tells stories about who we are and where we're going. Stories that feel real because they're fueled by past pain. And when you're alone with those stories, they can feel impossible to silence, but presence interrupts the narrative. There is something profoundly grounding about knowing you are not facing this moment by yourself. When someone sits with you in silence, the fear doesn't always vanish, but it loses its grip. The same is true with divine presence. It doesn't always remove the uncertainty, but it changes how much power that uncertainty has over your heart. Jesus never promised a life without fear, but he repeatedly promised his presence in the middle of it. That promise reframes everything. Fear says, "You won't survive this." Presence says, "You don't have to survive it alone." Fear says, "You are unsupported." Presence says, "I am here even when you can't feel me." And here's the hard truth most of us avoid. Fear gets louder when we try to outrun it. We distract ourselves, numb ourselves, keep busy, hoping noise will drown it out. But fear feeds on avoidance. Presence, on the other hand, asks us to stop running. It invites us to stand still in the discomfort and trust that we are not abandoned there. There is a quiet courage in staying, in breathing through the anxiety, in saying, "I am scared, but I am not alone." That kind of honesty weakens fear's authority. When we name our fear in the presence of God, it stops controlling the story. It becomes something we carry, not something that carries us. Fear wants to be the loudest voice in the room, but it cannot compete with a presence that is constant. Feelings rise and fall. Fear surges and retreats. But presence remains. It stays when the courage fades. It stays when answers don't come. It stays when the night feels too long, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, fear begins to lose its dominance, not because it's denied, but because it's no longer alone. Presence doesn't erase fear, it outlasts it, and in that space, something shifts. You begin to realize that the fear that once felt overwhelming is now standing in the shadow of something greater. We like to believe that we must arrive strong, composed, and faithful before we are worthy of being met by God. We tell ourselves that once we calm down, once we stop doubting, once we stop feeling angry or confused, then we can approach Him. But that belief quietly builds a wall between our real lives and our faith. What makes Jesus so radical is that He doesn't wait for us to become polished versions of ourselves. He steps straight into the raw, unfinished places where we are most human. Again and again, Jesus meets people in moments that are messy, painful, and deeply ordinary. He meets them when they're grieving, ashamed, sick, isolated, confused, or afraid, not after they've figured things out, but right in the middle of their struggle. That tells us something important. Our humanity is not something to overcome before God can reach us. It is the very place where He chooses to meet us. So many of us carry a quiet fear that our emotions disqualify us, that our questions are too big, that our anger is inappropriate, that our doubt somehow pushes God away. But Jesus consistently does the opposite of what we expect. He draws closer when people are at their weakest. He doesn't scold their emotions, He acknowledges them. He asks questions not because He lacks information, but because He honors their experience. When people were overwhelmed, He didn't rush them. When they were ashamed, He didn't expose them. When they were broken, He didn't avoid them. He stayed, He listened, He touched wounds, both physical and emotional, without hesitation. That kind of presence sends a powerful message. You don't have to hide who you are to be loved. The most powerful encounters with Jesus didn't happen in places of strength. They happened in places of vulnerability, at hospital bedsides rather than celebration halls, in lonely roads rather than crowded temples, in tears rather than triumph. That should change how we think about our own pain. Maybe the moments we're trying hardest to escape are the very moments where connection is possible. Being human means feeling the full range of emotions, hope and fear, faith and doubt, joy and grief, often all at once. Jesus never demanded emotional perfection. He never asked people to edit themselves before coming to Him. He allowed their honesty to lead the conversation. That tells us that our real selves, not our curated selves, are welcome. We often believe that faith should make pain disappear. When it doesn't, we feel guilty, like we're doing something wrong. But Jesus doesn't eliminate our humanity, He redeems it. He doesn't anesthetize our emotions, He walks with us through them. That's a very different understanding of comfort. Comfort isn't the absence of pain, it's the assurance of presence within it. To be met in your humanity is to be told that your feelings make sense, that your fear is understandable, that your tears are seen, that God is not disappointed by your struggle, nor surprised by your weakness. He knows the full weight of what it means to be human, and He chooses that terrain instead of avoiding it. When Jesus says, "I am with you," it is not a vague spiritual idea. It is a promise rooted in empathy. It is the willingness to enter suffering rather than observe it from a distance. It is the courage to stand beside you exactly as you are, not as you wish you were. And maybe that's the invitation we resist the most, to stop pretending, to stop performing, to stop striving for spiritual distance from our true emotions, to allow ourselves to be fully human in the presence of God. Because when we do, we discover something deeply sustaining. We are not too much, not too broken, not too complicated to be met right where we stand. We live in a world that quietly teaches us to numb, hide, or rush past our emotions. Somewhere along the way, we learned that being upset is something to fix quickly, something to apologize for, something to keep private so no one questions our strength. We applaud resilience, composure, and control, while discomfort gets labeled as weakness. But this way of thinking leaves us exhausted, disconnected, and deeply misunderstood, especially by ourselves. Being upset is not a character flaw, it is a signal. It tells us that something matters, that something hurts, that something inside us is asking to be acknowledged rather than silenced. When we treat being upset as failure, we turn against our own inner experience. We begin fighting feelings instead of listening to them, and that fight drains more energy than the emotion ever could. There is a dangerous assumption that strong faith equals emotional calm, that if we truly trusted God, we wouldn't feel anxious, angry, or overwhelmed. But strength was never meant to look like emotional denial. Strength is not the absence of emotion, it is the courage to remain present with what we feel without letting it define our worth. Jesus never equated emotional expression with weakness. He didn't shame grief, fear, or frustration. In fact, He allowed emotion to show up fully. He didn't bypass tears, He honored them. That alone challenges everything we've been taught about what it means to be strong in faith. When you're upset, your instinct may be to pull away, to isolate so you don't burden others, to minimize what you feel because others have it worse, or to push down discomfort so you can keep functioning. But being upset doesn't mean you're falling apart. It means you're processing life honestly. Suppressed pain doesn't disappear, it settles deeper, shaping our reactions, our relationships, and ourself in ways we don't always notice. There is a quiet bravery in naming your emotions without judgment, saying, I am upset, without adding shame or justification, is an act of truth. It requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is often mistaken for fragility. In reality, vulnerability is what allows connection, healing, and growth to happen. Without it, we don't heal, we cope, and coping can only carry us so far. Being upset often comes from caring deeply, from loving deeply, hoping deeply, committing deeply. The people who feel the most are not weak, they are invested. An investment always comes with emotional risk. When something meaningful is threatened or lost, emotion follows naturally. Pretending otherwise doesn't make us strong. It makes us disconnected from our own values. We also confuse composure with mastery. We think if we look calm on the outside, we must be coping well on the inside. But true strength is not about appearances. It's about integrity. It's about aligning what is happening internally with how we show up externally. When those two worlds disconnect, we feel it as tension, burnout, and quiet despair. Faith doesn't ask us to abandon our emotions. It asks us to bring them into relationship with trust, to say, this is how I feel, and I am still willing to trust. That kind of honesty requires more courage than pretending everything is fine. It means standing exposed rather than armored, present rather than protected. When we accept that being upset doesn't disqualify us, something shifts. We stop seeing emotions as enemies and start seeing them as messengers. We allow ourselves to feel without self-condemnation, and in that space, healing becomes possible, not because the pain is magically gone, but because we are no longer ashamed of carrying it. We are taught to wait for clarity before we move, to wait until the future feels predictable, until fear is gone, until every possibility is accounted for. We are conditioned to believe that certainty is the foundation of confidence, and without it, we are reckless or irresponsible. But faith has never operated on complete information. Faith begins where certainty ends, not when it arrives. Choosing trust before certainty is uncomfortable because it asks us to loosen our grip on control. Control feels safe because it gives us the illusion that if we plan enough, prepare enough, worry enough, we can avoid pain or failure. But certainty is often just a managing strategy, not a guarantee. Life rarely unfolds according to our plans, no matter how thoughtful or careful we are. Trust, on the other hand, is a decision made in the absence of proof. It is forward movement without full visibility. It isn't blind optimism, it's a grounded willingness to step forward despite not knowing how things will turn out. When Jesus says, I am with you, he isn't offering a detailed map, he is offering companionship on the journey. And companionship changes how much uncertainty we can tolerate. We resist trust because uncertainty makes us vulnerable. It exposes our limitations, our dependence, and our fear of getting it wrong. Certainty lets us feel competent. Trust asks us to admit we are not in control of outcomes. That admission can feel like weakness, but it is actually honesty, and honesty is the starting point of real faith. We often confuse trust with outcomes. We think if we trusted enough, everything would work out the way we hoped. But trust isn't a bargaining tool. It doesn't guarantee comfort or success. Trust is about where we anchor ourselves emotionally and spiritually while life unfolds. It is the choice to lean into presence instead of panic. Choosing trust before certainty means acting without reassurance. It means loving without guarantees, stepping forward without applause, obeying without knowing the reward. That kind of trust is risky. It opens us up to disappointment, misunderstanding, and loss. But avoiding risk doesn't protect us from pain, it just protects us from depth. There is a deeper kind of peace that comes from trust, and it doesn't depend on circumstances being resolved. It comes from knowing you are not the sole holder of responsibility. When you trust, you stop trying to carry the future by yourself. You acknowledge that some things are held beyond your understanding, and that you are not abandoned in the unknown. Certainty demands answers before action. Trust says, I will take the next step with what I know now. It values faithfulness over foresight. It recognizes that growth often comes through movement, not waiting. Waiting for certainty can keep us stuck indefinitely, because certainty is rarely complete. Trust also reshapes how we relate to fear. Fear doesn't disappear, but it no longer controls our decisions. We learn to say, I am afraid, and I will still move forward. That is not denial, it is courage. It's the willingness to let faith and fear coexist without letting fear dominate. When you choose trust, you shift from asking, what if this goes wrong, to asking, who am I walking with? That shift changes everything. The unknown becomes less threatening when presence is assured. You stop needing life to be predictable in order to be grounded. Trust before certainty is not about recklessness, it is about relationship. It is choosing connection over control, presence over precision, faithfulness over foresight. And in that choice, even when the path remains unclear, you find the strength to keep walking. Loneliness doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it's loud and obvious, but more often it's quiet and subtle. It can exist in crowded rooms, in familiar routines, even in relationships where conversation never stops. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen, unheard, and fundamentally alone. That's what makes loneliness so disorienting. It convinces you that connection is happening everywhere except where you are. Feeling alone has a way of reshaping how we see ourselves. It whispers that we've been overlooked, that we're forgettable, that if we mattered more, someone would notice our struggle without us having to explain it. Over time, those whispers turn into beliefs, and those beliefs slowly erode our sense of worth. The pain isn't just the absence of others, it's the meaning we attach to that absence. There is something especially heavy about feeling forgotten, not dramatically abandoned, but quietly left behind. The unanswered message, the prayer that feels like it echoes back, the progress that seems to pass you by while others move forward. These moments don't announce themselves as loneliness, but they settle into you just the same. What deepens the ache is the assumption that if you are alone, you must have done something wrong, that somehow your isolation is proof of failure, lack of value, or spiritual distance. But loneliness is not a verdict on your worth. It is a human experience, not a moral or spiritual one. When Jesus says, I am with you, he is speaking directly into that quiet despair, not as a metaphor, not as a comforting idea, but as a promise meant to confront the lie that you have been forgotten. Presence redefines loneliness. It doesn't always change your surroundings, but it shifts your internal reality. You may still be waiting, still grieving, still unsure, but you are not invisible. There are seasons where support is absent, where the people you expected to show up don't, where silence stretches longer than you imagined you could endure. Those seasons can make you question everything, your choices, your timing, even your prayers. But absence of human connection does not equal absence of divine presence. They are not the same thing, even though they often feel interchangeable. Being accompanied does not always mean being rescued. Sometimes presence looks like endurance rather than escape. It looks like quiet strength rather than dramatic change. It looks like waking up again and again, still uncertain, yet still holding on. And that kind of companionship is easy to overlook because it doesn't shout. Forgotten is a word that feels final. It suggests permanence, erasure, and loss of significance. But presence resists finality. It insists that even in obscurity, even in waiting, even in invisibility, you matter. Your life is still seen, your struggle is still counted, your name has not been misplaced. Loneliness tries to shrink your world until it feels like you are the only one holding yourself together. Presence expands that world just enough to remind you that you are supported beyond what you can see. That reminder may come quietly in moments of unexpected peace, resilience you didn't know you had, or strength that carries you further than you thought possible. There is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. One is circumstantial, the other is relational. When Jesus says, I am with you, he removes abandonment from the equation. Whatever else remains, the pain, the uncertainty, the waiting, you are not navigating it unsupported. Some of the strongest faith is formed not in community, but in solitude. Not because solitude is ideal, but because presence becomes personal there. It strips away the illusion that connection must always be visible to be real. And in that space, even when loneliness persists, it no longer defines you. You are not forgotten, not in your quiet persistence, not in your unseen effort, not in the spaces no one claps for. Presence stands beside you there, steady and unwavering, reminding you that even now, your life is held. Hope is often misunderstood as pretending everything is fine, as forced positivity, as a refusal to acknowledge how hard things actually are. We tell people to stay hopeful, when what we really mean is stop talking about your pain. That version of hope is fragile and shallow, and it collapses the moment reality doesn't cooperate. Real hope is not about denial, it is about courage, the kind that is willing to face the truth without turning away. Denial asks us to numb what hurts. Courage asks us to name it. Hope, in its truest form, is born not from avoiding pain, but from engaging with it honestly. It is the decision to remain open when closing off would feel safer. It is choosing to believe that meaning and presence still exist, even when outcomes are uncertain and suffering is real. There is nothing hopeful about ignoring reality. In fact, denial often deepens despair because it disconnects us from our authentic experience. When we pretend we're okay, we push pain underground, where it grows quietly and shapes us in ways we don't intend. Courage, on the other hand, brings pain into the light, not to be defeated, but to be held. Hope coexists with grief. It shares space with fear. It stands next to disappointment without asking it to leave first. That's what makes hope resilient. It doesn't depend on circumstances improving. It depends on presence being reliable. When Jesus says, "I am with you," hope becomes less about what might happen and more about who is walking with you through whatever happens. Courage doesn't mean confidence. It rarely feels bold or powerful. Often, courage feels like trembling honesty, like taking the next step even though your hands are shaking, like admitting you don't know how this will turn out, but you're still willing to move forward. Hope lives in those small, ordinary movements, not in grand gestures, but in perseverance. We sometimes wait to feel hopeful before we act, but hope is not a feeling we wait for. It is a practice we choose. It's the choice to show up, to pray again, to try again, to love again. Even when disappointment has taught us caution, that choice carries risk. It opens us to the possibility of being hurt again, but it also keeps us alive to possibility. Despair tells us that pain is permanent and meaning is gone. Hope argues back, not with certainty, but with courage. It says, "This hurts, and I am still here." It says, "I may not see the way forward, but I will not give up my place in the story." That kind of hope is strong enough to coexist with tears. When pain is minimized, hope becomes performative. When pain is acknowledged, hope becomes authentic. There is a deep relief in being allowed to be honest about struggle without being told you're faithless or negative. Real hope doesn't demand silence, it invites truth. Hope with God beside you is different from optimism you generate on your own. It doesn't depend on your emotional strength. It doesn't rise and fall with your mood. It rests on the assurance that even when you are depleted, you are not alone. That assurance anchors courage when energy runs out. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to let fear disconnect you from love, faith, or meaning. Hope is what keeps that connection alive. It reminds you that pain does not get the final word, even if it speaks loudly for a long time. To carry hope honestly is to walk forward without pretending the road is easy. It is to acknowledge the cost and still invest. It is to stay open in a world that teaches us to armor up. And in doing so, hope becomes not an escape from reality, but the strength that allows us to live fully within it.